It's a summer's morning on the river at Sunbury, and preparations are being made for what's become an 800-year-old tradition. The man in charge is David Barber.
I've been Queen Swan Marker now for just over 12 years. My role here is to look after the swans wherever the Queen exercises her prerogative right, and that is mainly on the River Thames. This is Swan Upping, and Swan Upping's been taking place since the 12th century. But today it is more a conservation exercise than what it was 800 years ago, which was really the swan was bred for the table, for banquets and for the gentry, really. That's what it was. But today nobody eats swan anymore.
Swan upping began in medieval times, when the king claimed ownership of all mute swans. The birds have been counted and monitored ever since, making this one of the country's longest-running conservation projects and a good indicator of the condition of the Thames. Swans were once so common, the Crown granted special licences to a few select companies so they could share the task of counting and owning the birds.
The vintners and dyers have owned swans since the 15th century, and they are really the only people that's kept their swan mark up for all those years on the River Thames. So they still have the right to this day to own swans on the Thames. The swan marking takes place from Sunbury to Abingdon each year, and it is really only completed on these stretches of the river. There is nowhere else in the United Kingdom that they actually mark the swans. Naturally there's tradition that goes with it, as you can see with the brightly coloured uniforms and the traditional boats. When we come to a catch of swans, we will surround the swans with the boats and then work the boats in closer and closer together, and then eventually the circle is very, very small and we can actually lift the swans from the water.
The swan markers are experts at handling the birds, who suffer nothing more than the loss of a little dignity.
The marking of the swans is done by a small stainless steel ring, and it has a number on it as well, so at least the young cygnet can be traced for future years. They used to be marked on their beak, but this was stopped a few years ago because you couldn't really get any history or any data from them. Now we can see where they go and what happens to them.
Although there are fewer swans today than in medieval times, the population is slowly rising again, due in part to a major clean-up of the river.
I think the River Thames is very healthy. The water is much clearer than it's ever been before. And I think the swans naturally like that because there's a lot more streamer weeds growing, and it's a good diet and vegetation for the swans.
Tom Wareham is an expert on the history of London's river.
We're all familiar with the water quality problems during the middle of the 19th century. But I think it's more interesting when you look back before that, because London's water basically came from the Thames. It was basically where Londoners and the early water companies drew their water. And there's an interesting fact about Thames water, which is that during the 18th century, sailors preferred Thames water on board ships. I mean, basically, when they carried water in casks, and it had to last 6 months minimum, they preferred Thames water. Now, the reason for that is apparently it carried a bacteria which, over a period of time, purified the water. So it was actually sweeter than the sort of water that you got elsewhere. But if you go back even further and look at things like the fishing industry, London has a thriving fishing industry, really up until the very early part of the 19th century. Fish is the common food of working people in London, and that's largely because there is so much fish. The river is very healthy. Even if you look at Elizabethan statutes relating to the management of the river, they are often about the conservation of fish stocks, telling fishermen that they can only take fish over a certain size. And all of these factors tell us that the river itself is actually of good quality.
But too much fresh water, it seems, can be a bad thing. It's the middle of August, and in central London, the summer heat is broken with a torrential downpour. A whole month of rain falls in just 1 hour. The city's drainage system becomes overloaded, and up to 300,000 tonnes of raw sewage is pumped straight into the Thames. In a matter of hours, parts of the river are turned into an open sewer. The next day, scientist Peter Lloyd from the Environment Agency is out on the river assessing the damage.
London's sewage system is designed on what we call the combined principle. So everything gets into the sewage system, foul drainage and also surface runoff. So when it rains, all your runoff from impermeable areas, roads and car parks and things ends up in the sewers, as well as the foul water. Obviously, the sewers have difficulty coping with this excess water, and the sewers have to overflow to the river to prevent flooding of London with sewage.
Peter's colleague, Maxine Clement, is also out checking the condition of the river.
I've been out on the River Thames here today for about 4 hours up at Barnes. I've been walking along the foreshore, gauging what the impact is of last night's rain. We had about 40 millimetres of rainfall in some places in West London. The discharges then occur very quickly after that rainfall. Within 6 hours we'll see the impact occurring on the river. Just looking generally along the foreshore here to see what debris is around that's originated from the sewers, like cotton buds, sanitary towels, condoms, all grease and things like that that people are actually walking through because they're walking along the footpath at the back of the river here. This river at high tide actually washes over that path, so all the sewage debris that was washed out of the sewers last night is actually now laying on the paths above us over here, so that's untreated sewage. It's quite a big health risk, really.
The summer storms have taken the water quality in the city back 200 years, when a growing population brought a similar crisis to London's river.
The problem comes in the beginning of the 19th century when you start to get the growth of urban London. And of course, Edwin Chadwick, who actually introduces the flushing lavatory, because where does that lavatory flush? It actually flushes into the Thames. The other big problem, of course, is pollution on the river through usage, steamships. There's no management of the environment in that sense. So both of these factors play an important role. As London grows, the amount of effluent going into the Thames becomes more and more of a problem. We end up with cholera.
Pollution from sewage was one of the biggest problems facing the city in the mid-1800s. Cholera epidemics struck fear into the hearts of Londoners and caused up to 30,000 deaths a year. Nothing survived in the foul water, and conditions were so bad that 1858 became known as the year of the Great Stink. In fact, the stench was so bad that sittings in the House of Commons had to be abandoned. Not surprisingly, with the problem literally on their doorstep, the politicians acted quickly, and a new sewage system was built for the capital.
Now, the innovation of this system literally intercepts the sewage on its way to the Thames. I think this fantastic bit of engineering where these miles and miles of interceptor sewers gradually grade down to the east end of London, where the sewage is stored in these massive underwater tanks.
These Victorian sewers are now 150 years old and were built for a city with a third of today's population. They simply can no longer cope with the storm conditions which London experienced in the summer of 2004.
This particular building behind me here, Western Pumping Station, that operated last night, and that pumped about 300,000 tonnes of sewage into the river. London's population to the west of this, in places like Kensington and Chelsea, all of the sewage from that part of London last night ended up in the river here. and it's that causes huge problems.
London is not about to return to the cholera epidemics of the 19th century, nor to the Great Stink of 1858, but the situation is having a catastrophic effect on fish life in the river.
The casualties that we see most obvious on this occasion are the large adult fish. Further upstream we've got a lot of juvenile fish, and quite a long expanse of river actually has been affected. In one way it's good to be able to see these fish because we know that these fish now live in the river, so we've had quite a big improvement in water quality over the last 40 years. It's just that now we have had that improvement in background quality and we've got this return of fish within the estuary. We do see the impacts that the storm sewage has on the river now much more obviously than we used to see.
It does revert to how it was in the past. The original sewers used to discharge directly to the river, and now what happens in times of rainfall, those same sewers revert to what they originally did, and the sewage goes straight into the river again as it used to.
The number of fish that we've seen today is probably a fraction of what really died. A lot gets washed out within the water of the estuary, and also a lot get predated by the birds along the foreshore. So today I've seen numerous seagulls, herons, cormorants, all feeding off the dead fish that are laying on the foreshore.
The damage to the Thames is not limited to tidal waters. Further upstream at Molesey Lock, salmon scientist Darrell Clifton Day has a grim prediction for 2004.
I was hoping for a much better year than this, but I think that the water quality events that we've had recently in the lower river are probably going to stop almost all of the salmon migration in the Thames. I think it's unlikely we're going to get more than maybe 20 fish this year, which is quite a disaster for us. Very disappointing.
On the Thames at Henley, the Swan Uppers have been joined by ornithologist Christopher Perrins from Oxford University.
I'm really checking on the condition of the birds. It's a fairly primitive way of doing it, but we can see whether they're growing at a reasonable rate by weighing them, and we know roughly how old they are from the head measurements. So we can just see if they're okay, and we count, of course, the number of broods and how many cygnets there are. It's the only place in the country which has long-term records of the number of breeding birds, and while there are now some national censuses, it is a quite useful way of keeping tabs on the health of the population. If there's one in the brood that's lightweight, then we give them an extra special check over for fishhooks, because that's one of the commonest causes. So if they're down inside, we can't do anything, we have to take them off to a vet.
The line has gone down there, it's cut into there.
Yes.
And then it's gone right down inside.
Has it right?
And I think it's down there, Chris said.
Right,
So
okay,
it's-
fair enough. So
All right.
it'll have to be an operation.
Yeah, I think it will be.
Yeah.
Fishing tackle problems are quite common, and we do lose quite a large percentage of young cygnets to fishing tackle. We are trying to improve this by bringing young children along, and we're trying to educate them a little bit on how to go fishing, and if they do fish, to be very careful with their discarded tackle. Be gentle, gentle. Right, should we move round? Any more children would like a stroke? Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Okay, bye-bye. Okay, all together.
Although swan upping is unaffected by events downstream, at nearby Molesey Lock, Darrell Clifton Day fears the storms will have a disastrous effect on the numbers of salmon and trout in the river.
Salmon and sea trout are excellent indicators of how good a river is and in what sort of condition it's in, because they have this migration from the headwaters out to sea. Over the last few days we've had these storms over London, and we've had discharges of storm water and sewage into the river, and it creates a chemical barrier that the fish can't swim past. When they come along and we get a couple of weeks of very low oxygen in the water, it means that the salmon run is basically stopped. The fish probably come up to this chemical barrier, and then they can't swim through it because they can't breathe, and they turn around and they probably go off and they die in the estuary somewhere. These storms are really quite catastrophic for the salmon every year. It's like going back 150 years really to the Victorian times when the river was just an open sewer.
Fortunately, water quality has been steadily improving since a major clean-up campaign in the 1960s and 70s. And in 1974, the first salmon for over 100 years was found in the river.
What I'm doing today is I'm going to see if we've got any salmon or sea trout in our salmon and sea trout trap here. These fish are moving upstream, and we catch them on the way at weirs like this one at Molesey in special built traps. And the fish are attracted to white water, so we pump out water at one end which attracts the fish in, and then they swim up into the trap section. We put them in anaesthetic because these are wild creatures and they don't like being caged, they don't like being handled too much. So we put them in this special fish anaesthetic which calms them down. It means that they're not going to get stressed out when we handle them.
Darryl weighs and measures the fish. His project is an important way of monitoring not only fish stocks, but also the quality of the water.
2.4 kilos. 555. I'll take some scales off it, which we'll use to tell how old it is. They lay down rings like a tree, and you can look at a section through a tree and find out how old the tree is. But you can look at a scale of a fish and find out how old that fish is as well. We also put a little tag in its back which has got my own phone number on it and a unique number for that fish, and if anyone else sees that fish around, they can phone that number and I give them a reward if they tell me where the fish was caught and what number fish it was. Lovely. It was quite happily swimming around when we caught it and quite happily swam off, so I don't think it's done it any harm, and it should be able to head off upstream and breed quite normally. These sea trout are native Thames fish. They're born in fresh water, in little tributary streams where it's quite shallow and narrow and very clean water. And they'll swim out, and they'll swim out to sea. And in the Thames, that means they're going to swim down through London, past the Houses of Parliament, past the Millennium Dome and the Thames Barrier, and out to sea. And then maybe a year later, they'll come back into the river, and they'll swim up the same river that they came from to breed. It's just this final blockage, really, to allow fish coming up through the estuary that we need to overcome if we're going to get a really, truly clean river all year round through London.
At the moment, the sewage in central London is causing this blockage and preventing the salmon and trout from migrating upstream. Back on the Environment Agency boat, Peter Lloyd is continuing his assessment of the river condition.
We're doing a number of runs up and down the river, just checking where the dissolved oxygen is worse, where we'd analyse the data and calculate the discharges that cause the main problem.
It's not the actual sewage that kills the fish, it's the bacteria that break down the waste, which uses up the oxygen in the water, effectively suffocating all aquatic life.
Well, what we're doing here is we're testing for the oxygen content of the water. We've taken a sample here of the river water, and we're adding chemicals to it to release iodine.
This chemical analysis measures the oxygen content in the water. It's a technique that has changed little over the past 100 years.
We actually have records in our office going back to 1885 of samples of river water taken. And I think it's because the River Thames has always been taken very seriously. It is our favourite river. It's the nation's heritage.
In the last 40 years, London has seen a dramatic improvement in the quality of its river water. But the ageing sewage system can no longer cope. One solution is to lay 2 new tunnels along the riverbed to take the sewage away. And the cost? £2 billion. Until a decision is made, the only alternative is to bubble oxygen back into the river from Thames Water's 2 oxygenating vessels. Each bubbler can pump up to 30,000 tonnes of oxygen into the Thames in a day, and they work round the clock after serious contamination in the river. But this is only a temporary solution, and despite their best efforts, it's estimated that 1 million fish have died in just 2 days.
I love the river. It's the jewel in the crown for Britain, and there's no way that we should discard it.
Swan Uppers, upstanding! The Queen!
The Swan Uppers travels have come to an end for another year. But for the Thames bubblers, it looks like a long journey ahead. It's a bright September afternoon on the Thames estuary near Malden, and an 80-year-old fishing boat is dredging for a delicacy that's been eaten since before Roman times. Over the years, it's been despised as fodder for the poor, but today, it's prized as food for the rich and the wealthy.
First fun all day. Almighty God, we know we are dependent for our daily needs on one another and on your providence. We praise you for your gifts to us in nature, by which our world is enriched and made fruitful. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you for the privilege of seeing the oysters being dredged.
The blessing of the oysters by the local vicar is part of the seafood festival held in Malden every year to mark the start of the oyster season on September the 1st. The shellfish have been harvested here for at least 2,000 years.
Do you want to try a cooked one? Do you want to try the cooked one? Try the uncooked one first. I will try a cooked one. OK, they're on the top.
Chairman of the council is John Archer.
Well, you can trace the oysters in Malden back to the Roman times. Now, in the Roman times, the oysters were very much a poor man's food. They were gathered out of the river and eaten to support families. But obviously things have changed over the years, and now the oysters are not probably a poor man's food, more a rich man's food.
As the oyster season begins, the hard work of gathering the shellfish starts in earnest. Stuart Clark is a professional oyster fisherman. He dredges the shellfish in the creeks around West Mersey, using equipment and boats that the Romans could have only dreamed about.
This is a French type of dredge. We've got the scythe here that just runs along the bottom, just off the bottom. You can see where that's just worn a little bit, where the shell and that flicks the oysters up into the bag. These are stainless steel rings that will let the small go through, so you're not taking away your stock. You're not taking away your next year's stock. So this is trying to get the dredge so it doesn't dig, because it'll dig up all these old shells and things. You just sort of want it skimming, creaming the top bit off, bumping along the bottom. The creek sort of runs down into like a V in the middle. So it's not like a flat road, there's all hills and holes, and if you get it too wrong, that'll dig right in, you'll just fill up with rubbish and that, and you'll catch a few, but you won't catch as many as you should,
Stuart Clark comes from a long line of oyster fishermen.
The family's got our own oyster land, and we try to work back. I think we got back to about 9 generations on one side and about 4 generations on my mum's side. And some of these lands up here, I think, were great-grandfathers. Got deeds going back on our oyster ground, they couldn't even sign a name, or just a cross. So that's in their blood.
By the beginning of the 20th century, vast quantities of oysters were dredged from the Thames estuary by hundreds of specially designed boats. Michael Emmett is now retired from sailing oyster smacks, but he'll never forget the problems in working those old boats.
They were a low, flat, working platform that sailed sideways as good, or if not better, than they sailed ahead. You had to steer by the gear as much as with the tiller. In fact, the tiller was almost useless most of the time. You would trim the sails with trice lines and rucking away and topping it back up again and having half a staysail and a full staysail up and down all the time, which is no wonder they all clapped their hands when decent diesel engines came round.
Whichever way the wind was where they ended up. They didn't have any power over nature. They just chugged along, you know. If it was foggy one day and no wind, they never went to sea. Or if they did, they didn't know where they were going. So they
Without today's modern equipment, fishing was a hard way to earn a living.
Yeah, you know, they didn't have this gear, didn't have oilskins and that. They just used to have long leather boots, thigh boots, old smocks, canvas smocks. You know, it was luxury, really. We could turn, go and have a cup of tea. They probably didn't even have that. They might have had a coal fire in the winter. They all huddled around while they were sailing out.
The teapot, that used to get emptied if you couldn't get more than 4 cups of water in it. And the tea was put in it and the water was put in it. That was put on the range and that stewed day after day after day. And we used to use this Nestle's milk that you get out like treacle and hard brown sugar. And I'll tell you what, you put a spoon in it and that took 10 minutes for it to fall over. You weren't sure whether to drink it, eat it, or tar the bottom of the boat with it.
When Dad used to put me ashore, I used to get cold, and like November time, and I used to go ashore and roar around the marshes and try and warm myself up. And I was sort of like 8, 9, 10. You know, you're out in the elements all the time. It could be pouring of rain and all sleety snow. You still got to go out and catch them. Your selling period is not very big, really. When you think from September to May, you've got to catch them oysters and get them out the door, sell them.
During the heyday of the oyster fishery, large fleets of oyster smacks worked the rivers and creeks around Malden and Mersey. It was hard physical labour hauling in the dredge.
Hand dredging, you would have one right up on the head or even out on the bowsprit with a little line so you could pull it to you. And then all the way along the side at intervals till you get right back to the stern. I used to work 5 dredges on my own, so you'd hardly got time to clear the one you were working on for the next one wanted pulling up. So you didn't stop. We used to reckon on maybe getting 2 or 3 oysters a chuck. We were just about nicely making a living at that time. But when my great uncles were at it in the 20s, they used to reckon on about 3/4 of a basket, maybe a wash and a half a week, would pay their wages and keep the boat. By the time I was at it, we wanted 6.5 wash in order to just about make an equivalent living ashore. And by the time I packed it up, you wanted 8.5. Well, of course, the fishery can't stand taking away that amount of stock just to make a living in each week.
For hundreds of years, Billingsgate Market has been the centre for London's trade in local fish and shellfish. The market's now moved from its original site, but it still serves the same purpose. Chris Lethwich is a food safety inspector at Billingsgate. Every morning he checks the quality of the fish on sale, just as it's been done for the last 400 years.
Since 1604, in the reign of James I, we've had the power to inspect fish and determine whether or not it's fit for man's consumption. And if you go back in the Middle Ages, the company used to have its own court, and if there was any dispute over fish that was sold, they would actually make a decision the same way as your modern courts will, although the punishments were a little bit different. I mean, for example, there was one case where a chap sold some smoked fish, and the court decided that the fish were not up to the standard, and the punishment that was meted out was the chap that sold the fish was actually put in the stocks, and the fish was burnt underneath him.
Today, the punishment for selling poor quality fish is not quite as dramatic as it was in the past. However, the inspectors at Billingsgate have been carefully monitoring the catches here for a very long time.
There's actually been a Billingsgate fish market for probably about 1,000 years. It originally was in the City of London on the embankment halfway between London Bridge and Tower Bridge, and it evolved there basically because that was the highest navigable point in the river.
Not very lively. This is a native lobster, and basically we're measuring it to see whether it's undersized. We take a measurement from the back of the eye socket to the end of what we call the carapace. And the measuring gauge goes in there, and that's got to be a minimum of 87 millimetres now. This one is literally just borderline, which seems to indicate that probably the fisherman has actually carried a gauge out to sea with him.
Back on the river near West Mersey, Stuart is sorting through his catch. Modern oyster fishing is like farming, with the young shellfish being planted like seeds.
We laid these oysters here in the spring, March time, to grow on. These, like this size oyster, was probably somewhere like that sort of size in the spring, but they weren't nowhere near as thick. They've grown ever so well in this certain area. I think probably because that's been left fallow for 2 or 3 years. It's a bit like farming, really, you know.
So where do you get them from?
They just come outside the estuary. I'm afraid that's on a need-to-know basis.
Traditionally, the native Colchester oyster is only harvested when there's an R in the month.
1st of September until about the middle of May, beginning to the middle of May, you can sell these oysters. The other oysters, these ones, you can sell them all year round. They're a Pacific type of oyster, dry gas. These taste sort of like a nutty, woody taste, peaty. These are sweet, these ones.
Further up the estuary, the traditional method of dredging oysters is being challenged by a new state-of-the-art system.
This system is 100 metres long. We've got 300 baskets per line. And the idea is you can hang these baskets on them and you can adjust them up and down to suit the growing conditions and the tide conditions.
Richard Emmons has imported this technique from Australia, and the early signs are very encouraging.
These oysters went in here at the beginning of the year. They've actually only had about a 5-month growing season. So they went in there as very young seed, about that big. So they've grown this much in 6 months.
We've had situations in Australia where we've actually taken seed at 4 mil through to a sale at 85 mil in 9 months. And in nature, in Europe, that would average out at about a 3-year cycle.
We're very, very pleased with the amount of growth that we've actually got in these oysters. I mean, it's twice what you get in those systems.
For Stuart Clark, the traditional method is still best. He's finished dredging for the day and needs to get his catch ashore. First, the oysters are washed and then sorted by weight.
We've got about 8 different grades of oysters, from 50 grams up to the large, which are 150 plus. By eye, you would never sort of pick one out and say that's a certain weight oyster. With this, that works on the carousel method. So as it goes up, each grade drops into the basket. different size oysters go to different customers. These 80s, 70s, 60s and the 50s will all go to Belgium, for the Belgian market. And these top ones are like all the restaurants in London have these. And some of the real big ones out of this basket, like that, will probably go to Paris. They're probably getting on for 200 grams, they are.
Quality control is essential for a successful fishing industry. Here at Fishmongers Hall in central London, the Worshipful Company of Fishmongers still governs the fishing.
Originally we were one of the guilds, and the guilds were established to control the quality of the product that was being sold and the skills within the trade. In the early days, the company received levies on all the fish that was sold within the City of London.
During the 14th century, the Worshipful Company of Fishmongers had a monopoly on the sale of fish, and the wealth and influence of the organisation increased enormously. But their domination of the industry wasn't to last.
When the company lost its monopoly on the fish being sold, it was granted instead the power to appoint 6 wardens to oversee the quality of fish. And in the early days of the company, those 6 wardens would have actually determined, made judgments on any disputes that would have arisen out of the sale of fish. So if somebody, for instance, sold some fish that was considered to be unfit, they could be dragged up in front of the wardens of the Fishmongers Company, who would actually make a determination on whether or not the quality was as it should be or shouldn't be.
Oysters have a fearsome reputation if they're not kept in peak condition, so quality control begins as soon as they come out of the water. Here at Richard Emmons' packing plant, the staff check the oysters closely for damage, quality and size.
If one makes a hollow sound when you knock it against another oyster, like that, it means that there's something wrong with it. It means it's either dead or it's got a problem with the shell. With this particular oyster, there's a problem with the shell. The shell's been broken around the lip here when we've handled it, and it's hollow. There's no water on the inside of it, which means it won't keep. So what we'll do with this oyster, we'll put this oyster back down on the beach in a bag, and within a month's time, the broken edges will have repaired themselves, and then it will go through the same process again. It will be washed, purified, and then sold.
Traditionally, all fish and shellfish caught around the Thames estuary would come here to the wholesale market at Billingsgate. Chris Lethwich again.
If you go back in the passage of time, the main outlet for oysters would have been Billingsgate Fish Market in the London area. I mean, obviously these days there is a lot of direct sales that go on to hotels, restaurants, catering suppliers may order their own, but we still get a substantial amount goes through the marketplace. One of the things that we check on is the fact that they've got these health marks. We can check where the products come from, the date they were dispatched. So if in the unlikely event there was a problem relating to these, we can check on the actual supply.
Once the oysters have been brought ashore, the only way to guarantee they're safe for human consumption is to purify them in tanks of bacteria-free water for at least 42 hours. Unfortunately, oysters haven't always been as safe to eat as they are today.
If you read some of the history books, especially when oysters were a poor man's food, you used to get horrific cholera outbreaks in London caused by oysters. The oysters were grown in the Thames. The Thames was really polluted in those days because every drain ended up in the Thames. The oysters used to grow like billio. They loved it. If oysters were picked off the beach or dredged up in the estuary and they'd been living in contaminated water, that was it. The contamination passed from the water to the oyster, from the oyster to the consumer. And it was a vicious circle.
Once the oysters have been purified in tanks, it's time to box them up ready for shipping. Stuart Clark still likes to use the time-honoured method of packing oysters tightly together with seaweed.
if you get somebody trading under Colchester oysters and the product is not very good, it has such a knock-on effect to the whole industry as a whole. So it's not to push anyone out, it's just to safeguard our little corner, if you like. It keeps them a bit cool. The seaweed, I mean, if you under there, that's still quite moist and it's been there since this morning, so it hasn't dried out. Plus that acts as like a little cushion to it. Like I say, is nature's bubble wrap. Not only that, it does look nice as well. You know, when you take your lid off and presented with a few oysters with a nice bit of weed round it, just sort of sets them off. Sometimes you have to just give it a thump, shake them down a bit. If you don't pack them down tight, I mean, one of the old boys years ago used to have a mallet and actually hammer the lids down to keep them tight. So they can't open then. Now it's actually squeezing that shell tight so they can't open and die or lose any of their juices.
Stuart Clark supplies some of the finest seafood restaurants in central London, where the native oyster is considered to be a particular delicacy. Patrick Flaherty is head oysterman at Wiltons, and he's considered to be something of an expert. After all, he's been shucking away for 42 years, and he can get through over 400 oysters a day. It's an art form that's been passed down the generations in this restaurant since 1742.
This is a French oyster knife. This is an English oyster. The reason we use English oysters is because I think they're the best in the world. And what you do, you get the knife and the side of the hinge, you wiggle it till you find that you're in, or you're not in, so you do it again. Once you're in, top shell off, turn it, and you just turn the oyster over where it becomes a better presentation. We average about 400 a day. We do probably 200 at lunchtime, and in the evening we may do another 250. When the ladies come in, they would normally have what we call a bearded oyster, which this is the beard round here. It's only a filter. Now what we do, we just put a knife in there, you do that, you take that right off, you do that, and that's what we call the medallion of oyster, and that is fantastic.
The Thames estuary has a long association with oysters. At times they've been a poor man's food, only to be eaten when little else was available. It was the Romans, however, who brought with them a passion for seafood of all kinds. And it's their enthusiasm for this delicacy which lives on today.
In. Must be close, but beautiful.
Where would you rather be here today then? Out here or sitting in an office? Sitting in a factory? Better than sitting on the M25, isn't it? If I didn't have a mortgage and a family, I'd do this for nothing.